Now, the theme for all of our lessons over this little study is how we're better together. Jesus, when he was in his last moments, he prayed that the church, the people of the church, you and me, that we'd be unified, that we would be one, the same way that he and God are one. It's kind of a picture of God. You know, God is love all by himself, and we are the body of Christ. And when we come together and we lean on one another and we boost one another up, we encourage one another, we support one another, it shows Jesus off to this world. And I do believe that the world is hungry to see a people like that. Now the problem, of course, the thing that is the big wrinkle, the fly in the ointment with all this plan, is that we're still broken. We may have the very best intentions, but we're still broken and we're still made of dust and ashes. And if we don't watch out, any one of us can kind of get sideways or turned around or on the wrong track. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about carrying one another's burdens when that sort of thing goes on, when life has a way of turning somebody around. Well, what do we do then? And how do we handle that? You know, we're all trying to be unified and now one person's having a hard time. How do we make that right? And that's what this passage is about. Just a few verses in the very beginning of Galatians chapter 6. He says, "Brothers and sisters, if anyone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently." Now, there's a couple things here that's worth pointing out. I mean, this part, that someone could be caught in a sin, well, when that happens all the time, we all the time run into that. We know what that's like. If someone's caught in a sin, and it can be anything. You know, maybe they're gossiping and they didn't used to, or they've allowed themselves their marriage is in some real trouble, and maybe even looking outside the marriage. Could be something where it's an addiction. You know, they've allowed themselves to self-medicate on any number of different things, and everything was going pretty good, and now someone's caught in a sin. He says, "You who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently." Now, it's not the same thing as saying, you guys who have it all together, because again, there isn't anybody like that who's got it all together. He's just saying those of you who have made a decision to put Jesus first and you're trying to follow him best you can, well, then you've got to go after that person. If you see somebody struggling, you've got to go after him. If you read in Genesis chapter 4, right after the Garden of Eden, right after Adam and Eve are on their own, their sons Cain and Abel are out there in the world, and Cain and Abel make a sacrifice to God. And it says that God values Abel's sacrifice but doesn't value Cain's. And the common thinking is that Cain had sin in his life that he wasn't dealing with. And so God chooses Abel. And you could even argue that maybe Abel's offering was the first fruit offering. It was a more valuable offering. And so anyway, whatever it was, and it made Cain mad that God looked on Abel with favor but didn't look on him with favor. And it made him mad enough to kill. And God tries to talk him out of it. You know, why are you here stewing? Don't you realize sin's at your door? Don't let this sort of thing get control of you. But Cain won't listen, and he gets his brother alone, and he kills him. And God confronts him on it. He says, "Where's your brother?" And Cain's response is, "Am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he is. What business is it of mine?" And the curiosity of that story is that Cain assumes that God will agree with him. You know, hey, it's not my problem. You know, it's not my day to look after whoever it is. But see, we are supposed to be our brother's keepers. So if one of us who's made a decision to live by the Spirit, we have another person in our brotherhood who's struggling, we've got an obligation to at least try to say something. And I know it's awkward, and I know it's hard, and sometimes it's really tough to think about how to bring it up into conversation. You know, hey, I'm worried about you is often a good way to start, but it's hard to bring it in. And so he tells us, you want to restore is the goal, and you want to do it gently, and both those words are important. My goal is not to punish them. My goal is not even to get them to say they're sorry. My goal is to get them back to where they're living by the Spirit, right? Where we're all going the same direction again. Because often, again, Adam and Eve are a good example of this. When they first fall into sin, the very first thing they do is hide. They make clothes so they can hide from one another, and they actually hide behind bushes and shrubs and trees to hope that God won't see them there. The very first thing you'll do when you're caught up in sin is you'll start to withdraw. You won't be as open to your spouse. You won't be as open to your parents or your kids. You won't be as open to your church. It'll be easier and easier to skip not only coming to church, but easier and easier to skip wanting to read or pray. One of the consequences of sin, almost by its very nature, is that you'll withdraw. And so when we see somebody doing that and they're starting to pull away, we need to restore them, get them back on the path with us. It's not a matter of them being good or us being good. We're just trying to get them back where we're all walking towards Jesus. He warns you, Paul does, he says, watch yourselves. You might also be tempted. And we're going to talk more about that here in a second. But be careful. You know, if you dive into somebody else's problems, you may have a lot of opportunity to do something stupid yourself. You know, if you see what they're into and it's a pretty good story, you might be tempted to gossip or slander. If you see what they're doing and you never, ever, ever, ever would have been tempted to do something like that, well, you might think suddenly that you're better than everybody else. Pride could creep in, and Paul's going to talk about that. The key here is we want to carry them. Carry each other's burdens. And this word for burden, it's a boulder-sized burden, something so big that nobody can carry it. It's possible that this burden is because they got into the problems they got into. You know, somebody is into an addiction of some sort, the burden might be the addiction. They chose it. They chose the path to get themselves in this problem, but now that they're in the problem, they're finding it very, very, very hard to get out. You know, the burden, that could be the broken marriage. And he or she contributed pretty heavily to that broken marriage. I mean, they did a lot of stuff to make the other person give up. But now that the other person has given up, and we're trying to win them back, oh, how did I get in this hole? And it's a burden bigger than they can carry. So you then, as a Christian, you come in beside them and you try to help them navigate the different storms of life. And in that way, he says, when you do it, you're fulfilling the law of Christ. When you carry somebody else, well, you're like Jesus because he came and carried us. We were broken in every possible different way, and Jesus, who's perfect, though he was rich, became poor for our sake, so that we who are poor might become rich in him. He goes on. He says, if you think you're something that you're not, you're deceiving yourself. And you could apply the anyone here to the person who got caught into sin. You know, he thought he had it all handled. Thought he had it all. As a preacher, sometimes I think I could fall into a hole like that. It'd be tempting to say, you know, after all I'm doing for the Lord, aren't I entitled to have my little bit of happiness doing whatever else it is that I want to do? After all I've done, surely I'm entitled to let my hair down here, so to speak, in some sort of fashion like that. After all and you can lie to yourself like that. So the anyone could be the guy who got caught in sin. But it's more likely that the anyone here is the person who's trying to bring them back. He says, don't think it's you're something special because you're going after them. You know, even if I've never been tempted to fall into heroin, but if I was helping somebody who has fallen into heroin, I don't want to start thinking, well, I could never do that. I would never be as stupid as this person's been. I would never, ever, ever. Because you don't know what you would have done. If you had been in his shoes or her shoes, if you had the same things happen to you that happened to them, if your life had the same consequences, the same strengths and weaknesses they deal with, I mean, you don't know for sure what you do. And so Paul's encouragement here, don't start thinking you're somebody special because you're on the strong side right now. Because probably if we all live long enough, you'll be on the weak side soon enough. That's just how it is. We're all broken. And this picture of Christian unity is not about a bunch of strong people. It's about a bunch of sinners all holding together as we sail closer to Christ. He says each one should test their own actions, and then you can take pride in yourself alone without comparing yourself to someone else. I mean, if I start feeling like I'm righteous because I'm a little bit ahead of you in one thing or another, I really haven't proven anything. I'm still not nearly as righteous as I ought to be, and I'm still not nearly as righteous as Jesus. And even when I compare myself to you, I don't know what your situation is. I don't know what you've come through and what you've not come through. I don't know what you've accomplished and what you've not accomplished. You know, as just a way of thinking about it, there might be two neighbors, Jim and Chuck, and Chuck has everything. I mean, his parents are happy and the marriage is great, and he's got two little brothers, and they never fight. None of them do. And Chuck's dad has done pretty well in business, and Chuck's mom's got her own little business going there too. And by the time Chuck is ready for school, they have all the time in the world to read to him and study with him. He does great in school, you know. He does great in school. His college is all paid for. He gets a job, and he starts in Dad's business, and everything's kind of handed to him. And he makes something of himself. He does. He has some trouble. I mean, his marriage isn't always rock solid. Sometimes they fight a little more, and he drinks a little more than he should on the weekends. But by and large, Chuck's the kind of guy you'd want to have as your neighbor. Jim's family's screwed up as they can be. Dad and Mom fight physically all the time until one day Dad beats Mom bad enough that the police intervene. And Jim never sees his dad again after that. Mom kind of devolves into drinking, which is something that Jim swears he'll never do, but before he's 12 years old, he's already drinking pretty steady behind Mom's back. By the time he's out of high school, he's a mess. The police already know who he is. He's just run into all sorts of things. Now, both guys, right as they were finishing high school, Chuck and Jim, they became Christians. And for Chuck, it was to be expected. His family were all Christians. His grandparents were Christians. Great-grandparents have always been Christians. And they were always prominent at the church. And Dad and Mom were both leaders there. But for Jim, it was a pretty big shock. I mean, nobody else was pushing him that way. Jim's life is not good. I mean, he never totally is able to kick the demons with the alcohol. He's never totally able to get himself on the straight and narrow. He never totally figures it out. He always struggles with anger. He always struggles with depression. He's always getting into fights. He marries twice and can't seem to hold those things together. He is a pretty good dad to his kids when he gets to see them, but he doesn't get to see them all that often. And when he gets to retirement age, he's got Social Security, and that's about all he's got. Whereas Chuck retires very comfortably. Now, when they die, and they're standing before God in judgment, you might think that Chuck's the guy who really accomplished something. But you know, with everything he was given, he was about average for where you'd expect him to be. But Jim, man, when you look at where he started, I mean, by the end of his life, maybe he's still not quite the stand-up guy that Chuck is, but he grew much, 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 much more than the other guy did. And I think God sees that stuff. Paul says, test your own actions. Don't grade yourself compared to somebody else. Are you growing? Are you getting stronger? Every year, are you learning more about the Lord? Are you getting deeper with His people? Are you serving more? Are you giving more? I mean, don't grade yourself compared to somebody else. Grade yourself compared to you. How are you doing in your walk with Christ? And then you can take pride in yourself alone. And you're not comparing yourself to someone else, because everyone should carry their own load. Now, you could read that and think, well, wait a minute. Just the last slide, didn't it say to carry each other's burdens? And now you're saying I got to carry my own load. And the part of the key to understanding that is the words he uses for burden. When he says in verse 2 earlier, carry your burden, that's a boulder-sized burden. This word load is more of a backpack-sized word. It's not quite as big. It's the stuff that all of us have to deal with. And so there's that. But even without that in mind, you want to, as much as you can, take care of yourself. You don't want to depend on anybody else, because no one else is going to be able to vouch for you to get you through to Jesus. It's just going to be you standing with Him one day, right? You can't say, well, I would have done better if Jenny would have told me more, or I would have done better if only John would have helped me out. It won't matter then, right? So you make sure that you're right. But at the same time, if each of us, as we're trying to, do best we can for ourselves, if each of us are also keeping an eye out for our neighbor, trying to help them, pushing them along, even though we're not asking our neighbor to do it, he's watching us too, and he's kind of pushing us along. I'm trying to carry my own load, but he's also helping me best he can. Man, that's what it's all about. And when a church makes a decision as a whole community to live like that, I think it's magnetic to the world. Our brokenness can actually bring out Christ's grace working through us even more powerfully, if that makes sense. And I think it's all part of His plan. as he tries to draw us together and make us better together.